You want me to start? Okay. Okay, we can start. Ready? Yeah? Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this session on war crimes investigations and accountability using open source techniques. The world currently feels like it's in permanent crisis. The Ukraine war is in its third year. Over 6 months after October the 7th in Israel, the conflict in Gaza is not abating. The civil conflict in Sudan has left thousands dead, including in West Darfur. Fighting continues across Myanmar, with the UN warning just this week of a heightened risk of conflict again in Rakhine State. Fighting against insurgencies in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger regularly lead to the killings of hundreds of civilians. All our organizations here today try to cover these conflicts as best we can with limited resources, and therefore turn regularly to open source investigations techniques to do so. Increasingly, also, so are accountability bodies such as the International Criminal Court or UN fact-finding missions and commissions of inquiry. Our goal here today isn't to talk about the methodologies and how to do this work. There have been a lot of fantastic sessions here over the last 3 days on that, but rather to discuss some of our experiences using open source techniques covering conflicts and crises around the world to expose possible war crimes or violations of international humanitarian law and other grave violations of human rights, and how we, different organizations, play into and support this ecosystem, ultimately with the goal of achieving some form of accountability or justice. And we'd like to also share and discuss some of the lessons we've learned in doing so. So on the panel with me today are Megha Rajagopalan, international correspondent at the New York Times, Manisha Ganguly, visual investigations lead at The Guardian, Nick Waters, open source analyst at Bellingcat, and I'm Sam Dubberley, director of digital investigations at Human Rights Watch. We'll do a couple of rounds of discussion, questions, and then we'll leave a bit of time, hopefully from questions from you at the end. So I'm going to start with Manisha. Hi, Manisha. Could you give us a quick overview of how you at The Guardian are using open source in your work and how that aligns with some of the key moments in the evolution of open source for accountability and justice purposes?
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for being here. I've been busy, as most people here have been, over the last 6 months covering the war in Gaza. So no foreign journalists have been allowed access there by Israel and Egypt. So most of the work that we've been doing have been visual investigations using satellite imagery. But I sort of started out in open source after a very key arrest warrant which was issued by the ICC in 2017. There was a Libyan warlord named Mahmoud al-Warfali, who was indicted for 33 counts of murder which he filmed, and the video of which was uploaded and available on YouTube and multiple social media outlets. That was sort of the first case of the ICC trying to prosecute on the basis of open source evidence. But to me, as a journalist, it sort of indicated 3 key things about it. One is that, that this kind of evidence is permissible in court. 2, Warfali was the leader of a special forces brigade, which was led by the current warlord in Libya, Haftar. And it indicated that if the person who was leading the Special Forces Brigade, Al-Saika, was capable of doing this, then there was a culture both of impunity within that organization, because this was starting at the top of the chain, and also a culture of documentation. So the first ever documentary that I made when I was 23 looked specifically at members of the Al-Saika Brigade. So I created a sort of fake fan account of Warfali on Facebook, infiltrated the Al-Saika Brigade's closed sort of Facebook groups and open fan pages of Warfali, and started identifying fighters in that unit who were desecrating the bodies of opposition fighters. So that's everything from beheading to stringing them up for display, massacring civilians, mislabeling dead civilians as members of ISIS, all of which was documented and was publicly available on Facebook and was used to incite violence. The ICC was particularly interested in that case at that time, so they did have a look at the evidence, but then shortly afterward, like most people here, I did a lot of work on Syria, which at that time was the most widely documented conflict. And with Syria, it was sort of twofold, because on the one hand, you had so much material coming out that you could use to verify and hold state actors to account when the ground reality differed with the state narrative being put out. But also, what I found interesting was state actors like Russia, who were doing double tap attacks, which, by the way, is a war crime, on civilian markets in Syria, were then using satellite imagery and open source evidence in their own press conferences to essentially point at areas and say, look, we didn't bomb the civilian market, which you could then geolocate and find out that the market that they claimed to have not bombed was actually 5 to 10 kilometers away from the market that they did bomb. So that was sort of a weaponization of, attempted weaponization, I'd say, because Russians are quite clumsy at this, attempted weaponization of open source evidence, which sort of really got me into that. And since then, I've sort of worked on Ukraine and currently with Gaza.
Great, thank you so much. And Megha, how about you? You've reported on China's vast network of incarceration of Uyghur Muslims, and you're now at the New York Times. How has open source contributed, in particular, to your work as a reporter and correspondent examining grave crimes?
Yeah. So I think I'm perhaps the only one on this panel that comes from a traditional kind of reporting background. So I'm like fairly fresh to this field, I think. I think for me, like I came to that subject, the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in China, like kind of as a beat reporter. I had worked as a beat reporter in China for like many years, like followed the story and then reported on it kind of in conventional ways, including, you know, like even visiting one of these camps, like by like going on foot and sort of manually finding out where it was. And I ended up coming to this through a woman named Alison Killing, who is an architect and investigator who now works at the Financial Times and is really good, and a programmer named Christo Buszczak. And basically, I think what OSINT brought to that project is that we were seeking to not tell a single story, but tell a story about the whole program, like sort of at scale, which would have been pretty much impossible through conventional reporting techniques because, like, you know, like the situation in Gaza and Syria as well, like there was no access. So like there was no way we could have actually gone physically to any of these locations. So we ended up doing a project that ended up lasting like something like 2.5 years and finished in the beginning of 2022 for BuzzFeed News, where we used a combination of satellite imagery and business records and like a few other sources of data to sort of locate where all these camps were. We also measured the floor areas, which combined with Chinese prison regulations told us how many people would be held inside, and looked at businesses that were using forced labor within the premises of these camps and prisons. I think I learned a lot from that project, and I'm really grateful to have done it. Some of the things I learned were around sort of like how do you bring something like this to like editors that don't really understand what OSINT is? And how do you get editors to see this as something that is like not something you do just to cut costs because you don't want to send a reporter on a trip, but some like a technique that can be used in certain kinds of stories to tell different kinds of stories, broader stories, bigger stories, and also in complement with traditional forms of reporting. In our project, I think one of the things that we did that resonated with readers the most is that you know, we combined OSINT and kind of like extensive like showing of evidence with narrative. So I spent a lot of time like, you know, sitting with people, interviewing them. We got great images and like that was super helpful in helping people connect with the story about a part of the world that at that time wasn't really in the news that much, and that people didn't have like sort of like an implicit connection to. So I feel like what I try to do in my work is sort of marry narrative and kind of traditional styles of journalism with OSINT techniques, like particularly used by people that are genuine subject matter experts.
That's great, thanks. And at Human Rights Watch, to kind of take the flow further forward, you know, we're obviously not a news organization. Human Rights Watch, although I think we would call ourselves somewhat, journalism adjacent maybe. We're trying to tell stories, we're trying to bring stories out into the world. But that kind of progression that you're talking about, Megha, is very much something that I've seen in my 2 years at Human Rights Watch. Is when I joined, I think we were just getting to space where we were thinking, okay, we can do something more with open source. So the Syria example that you were giving, it was like, we would like look at, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I used to be at Amnesty before that, we would be like, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch verified 8 videos through all the techniques that probably everyone in this room knows, showing that this happened. And I think where the evolution has come for us, which is, I think where you're going to as well, Megha, is we're now thinking about how we can use that in our own storytelling to reach various audiences, and we'll come to the audiences in a second. But my team is kind of nestled in the heart of research at Human Rights Watch. We're a small team of 5 people, and we cover all the conflicts and all the crises that Human Rights Watch covers. So we've gone from a stage of like just looking at, verifying videos or finding satellite images and saying this happened, to thinking about how do you push that forward. And I think recently what we're trying to do is also thinking about how do you lean into the scale that open source gives us, the provision that open source gives us. So looking at, for example, areas where we can't access. So we recently published a big investigation into the siege of Mariupol from March 2022 until May 2022, where we did a full damage reconstruction of the city using only open source video. Because what we were realizing was satellite imagery only showed the tops of the buildings, but the way the city was assaulted was they were hitting into the side of the buildings as well and making the city uninhabitable. So we were using the open source videos, geolocating, chronolocating, all those techniques that everybody knows about now. We were able to then show that 93% of the buildings in the city were destroyed, which I think has been an interesting experiment for us. It's not a story that made massive headlines at Human Rights Watch. It wasn't picked up massively by the media, but in terms of what we're trying to achieve, in terms of our push for justice and bringing awareness to these crimes, I think it's going to have a bit of a long tail. The other thing we're experimenting with a lot of at Human Rights Watch is thinking about, as we do open source investigations, how can we use that to provide content to news outlets to also push our message forward. We're cognizant of the fact that resources are stretched for all of us. So if we're doing open source investigations and we can provide that then content to selected journalists who we know will do a good job of that, people at this table, for example, we feel that can help us move forward with our work. So it's really become a key part of the work at Human Rights Watch, especially in the conflicts we can't access, which actually, if you've got Human Rights Watch on your business card, is actually not many of them these days. But it's helping us to investigate Sudan, it's helping us to investigate Gaza, it's helping us to investigate October the 7th in Israel, it's helping us to keep an eye on Myanmar. But I think the one thing, and we'll come back to this a bit later, and I'm going to pass on to Nick in a second, but I think one thing that's also very important here is we make sure it's not the be-all and end-all. I think we're also very aware at Human Rights Watch that war crimes aren't always captured on camera. They're not always visible on satellite. And maybe we can talk about this a bit later. So just making sure that we're also covering other crimes as and when they happen. But so our role here is not the first draft of history, as Manisha and Megha kind of do. It's like building on that a little bit, staying a bit longer, and trying to push for justice in our own way. But we often get asked, do we then give that information to prosecutors? And actually, no, we don't. That's not our job. We believe that we should publish our information, and prosecutors would then hopefully pick it up and build on it. That needs to be done independently. But to transition to Nick, maybe you can actually fill in the end of that chain and what you're doing at Bellingcat in terms of accountability.
Yeah, sure. So at Bellingcat, we from 2014 onwards, we noticed that a lot of our work was being used by accountability mechanisms, specifically the Joint Investigation Team, who are investigating the shoot down of MH17. And what we noticed is that the JIT would basically read our report, and then about a year later, you'd read the JIT report, and they basically recreated the steps that we had carried out. Obviously, we'll talk about archiving later, where that information was available. And so we thought, hey, you can use this these kind of techniques for some kind of accountability purposes. And at the end of 2018, basically, Elliot Higgins from Bellingcat, Rowan Shafe, who was a freelance reporter at the time, who'd just returned from Yemen, and Dubberley Minogue from the Global Legal Action Network got together. And they noticed that this information could fill an evidentiary gap that existed. So at the time, there was a court case regarding the weapon sales of British weapons to the Sadler Coalition. And what GLAN, the Global Legal Action Network, were trying to do was demonstrate there was a risk that these weapons would be used in breaches of international humanitarian law. However, access was extremely difficult inside Yemen, and simply demonstrating that these strikes had taken place was difficult. And so what we did is we started the Yemen project in 2019, where we collected this open source information using this pretty basic at the time methodology, with the intent that it could be used as evidence later, so it could actually be used as evidence in court. That was interesting. That was the start of a lot of what we do at the Justice Accountability team. And since then, we've refined that quite significantly. And in 2021, we held a mock hearing examining whether one of these videos that had been placed online could in fact be introduced as evidence. Because at that time, it was a little bit of a gray area. Because when you get a video from Twitter, from Facebook, and the metadata has been removed, you don't know who filmed that video. And so therefore, you need someone to actually say, that video is authentic, that video does show what it purports to show. And in order to do that, you need to use these open source techniques. And so, yeah, we tested this in a mock hearing under common law, so the law of England and Wales, and with me acting basically as an expert witness. And the judge, Judge Joanna Corner, said she would, in fact, accept this video as evidence. That's quite significant. Judge Joanna Corner now sits at the ICC. And she also said that she would accept my testimony as an expert witness, which is interesting, because when you are, I don't know if anyone's seen the mock hearing, you have this defense lawyer trying to paint me as like, I think the technical legal term is like a fraud and a charlatan, which was quite interesting. So that was in 2021, and then when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine took place, it was clear that this was somewhere we could apply this kind of methodology. So we updated the methodology, and since then, since February 2022, that's what we've been working on, like just single-mindedly collecting information to be used as evidence. And so far, we've worked on requests for information from the OSCE, from strategic litigation organizations like ECCHR, Clean Air Foundation, as well as prosecutors at national and international level. And it's been really interesting seeing the development of this from journalism through to advocacy, to the point where now actually I'm not really doing journalistic stuff. I'm doing this kind of investigation at the request of prosecutors. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about this later as well, but that's why you haven't seen us publish much, because what we're doing is going into an evidentiary database, which we're then making available to prosecutors. Yeah.
Can I just follow up on one thing with you, Nick? So at Human Rights Watch, one of the things that I think has been really useful for us on the various conflicts we've covered is making sure we have the methodology pinned down that we just repeat every time. Right? So when it comes down to, we get criticized, surprise, surprise, from whoever we get criticism from, we can just turn around and say, well, we use the same methodology in Ukraine as we've used in Sudan, as we've used in Myanmar, as we've used in Gaza. It's the same every time. So if you like that one, there's no reason why you shouldn't like this one. So how important is that method? Could you talk through actually the Bellingcat GLAN methodology and like how important that's been in the court as well? Yeah,
sure. So this is a methodology that essentially at its core is just open source investigation that like anyone here would be able to do. It's just making sure that you record all your steps, that you make certain decisions and you record what those decisions are, that you systematically archive every single piece of information that you come across. The idea is that when you hand over these reports or this information in Uwazi evidentiary database, someone will be able to essentially recreate that process if they so wished. But also, because we have this public methodology, the idea is that, in fact, these reports would, in fact, be court-ready, so you could use them as reports or as evidence directly in court. So it's actually not that complicated when you get down to it. There's a lot of annexes talking about like various decisions. So for example, like when to join closed groups, when not to join closed groups, the kind of biases that are involved in these kind of investigations. But really, ultimately, it's just open source investigation done in a systematic format and recorded at every step of the way.
I should also mention another great document, which around that, if anybody's interested, is called the Berkeley Protocol, which was set up by the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley, which we've collaborated with very closely as well. But yeah, that methodology is so important for us internally, just to have that set down and work through it every time. Megha, back to you. So we talk a lot about trust in investigations, and we talk about the Human Rights Watch internally establishing trust for accountability for justice mechanisms. How are you approaching that at the New York Times in terms of building trust with readers when you're reporting on conflict crisis?
Yeah, I guess I can't speak for the whole Times, obviously, but I would say I've been thinking about this issue a lot because obviously we all know that reader trust is not doing well, but then I guess thinking about this from the open source context, in an environment where we're now having way more fake images, fake video, fake narratives, fake everything. How do you keep doing this work while maintaining reader trust? I remember when I first started working on projects that used OSINT, people were just so stunned to just by the kind of showing of the work, just to see the methodology, see where things came from and how easily they could access a thing like a satellite image, that there was sort of an implicit trust that was offered that would be even greater than kind of a traditionally reported story, which is based a lot on the reporter's sources and requires the reader to sort of trust that the reporter is, being an honest broker and that the publication is reliable. I think OSINT offered some benefits on that, but I think now because of how easy it is to fake images, I think some of that is probably going away, and I've noticed some of that just in responses to stuff that I've worked on. I don't know what the solution to this is. I do think one of the things that I've done recently, on a piece investigative piece that we published at the Times, is that I'm spending, many of you probably, a lot less time on X, and have also found that to be quite, it's not productive, I don't think, really, to engage there in the way that it used to be with readers, but I've been engaging actually in our comments section, which is such an old school thing, but I think that actually has, I've seen people come to the work that way, and it's actually been gratifying because I was actually I was always told to never read the comments, but actually a lot of our commenters are really smart, and it's been good to engage in kind of that old-fashioned way. I think other things are just our visual investigations team at the Times, I think, does such a fantastic job at this, but I think just showing the work in different mediums is also really helpful. We put out a 3-minute video to go with this whatever 4,000 word piece, or some absurd word count, and then of course tons of people watch this video, and that's, while that's sad as a writer, but I think that is a great medium to show data and imagery, and in a way that is very comprehensible by people, and I guess it's not great to be the story, but I think showing some of yourself helps to sort of build that trust. I'm sure that there are lots of other ideas about how to approach this, but I think mainly what I'm trying to say is that I think it's something that we need to start thinking about, and specifically from an open source lens, as well as just as news people and media organizations.
And Manisha, at The Guardian, you're experimenting with different formats to expose violations using open source. And for example, I think one of the pieces I was the most jealous of, in a good, positive way, last year was your Shireen Abu Akleh piece The Guardian did into the killing, and the day of events that surrounded that, showing all the other crimes that were happening at the same time. What's been successful for you in kind of experimenting with different formats of, building that trust through open source, showing the methodologies through open source, what works with the audiences, what doesn't, frankly, work with the audience?
So I'm a little bit biased because I trained as a filmmaker, then I went into journalism, and I was making documentaries for the BBC for about 5-6 years. And then I went to work for a newspaper, which is The Guardian, which also has a digital format. I think open source is such a visual way of investigating that I think videos or mini documentaries is the natural companion to these kinds of investigations, because I find that if you put every nitty-gritty, every detour that you've taken in your methodology in a document, it tends to read more like a legal document, which puts audiences off because they want to engage with it. And more importantly, a lot of the time, because open source is so cold and clinical, we lose focus of why we're doing this. We're doing this for the victims. We're doing this to make visible what has been erased, to put them in the foreground, and to hold power to account and give them back the voice that they've been deprived of. And I think documentaries is a really powerful way of doing that, because you can actually put a face instead of just saying X number of victims were killed. You can listen to their stories. So in the case of the Libya one, I tracked down sort of one of the only survivors of the Gunfuda massacre, who was living in exile in Canada, and he didn't know what had happened to his family, but I had found this video where I'd identified his mother, his two sisters, and his two brothers, who were sort of lying dead in that pile. And one of the fighters was stomping on their faces and pointing to his mother, saying, this is, excuse my language, he said, this is the whore of ISIS. And the reason I started looking at it is because she was a 77-year-old woman with white hair. And I eventually, when I bent back and showed him the video in 2019, it was the first time that he had actually come across the bodies and found out what had happened to his family, because he had no idea for that 2 years whether his family was buried, what had happened after the massacre. There was no news. And I think when I show the film, it's all sort of fun and games because, you know, haha, we catching these bad guys taking selfies with their crimes, which is permissible in court. But then when you get to the bit when Ali is actually looking at the photo and saying, this is my mother, nobody disputes that this is my mother, that feels like a gut punch. And the entire sort of audience goes quiet, and that's when I know that the work has been worth it. That being said, Gaza has been really tricky because you do have an endless proliferation of video imagery, and cutting through that fog of war has been tricky, but also because we're a digital publication. So I think my colleagues might be here, Elena and Ashley, who have been absolutely brilliant. And what we realized is that there was far too much imagery and far too much satellite imagery and videos to sort of fit into a traditional print article. So we actually came up with a format which we successfully used in our investigation into domicide, where we looked at 3 areas of Gaza to look at how civilian infrastructure had been destroyed. And it's a combination of satellite imagery, drone footage, videos, testimony, and then all of that evidence is then presented to 3 of the best experts in domicide in the world, who essentially make an argument that all of this destruction was intentional by the Israeli army so that people returning wouldn't have a home to return to, and that this should be codified under international law as a war crime.
Yeah, I think I still owe you a quote for that piece, don't I?
Yes, yes.
Never got back to you, sorry. I mean, I think you raised one interesting point that we've been thinking about a lot at Human Rights Watch, is that, again, that going back to that whole transition from we verified 10 videos that showed to actually then getting down to people. Because if you want to prove crimes, you know, open source is really useful and having the video evidence is really useful, but you need to get to people. And I think, you know, a few years ago for us, it was definitely that you found a video, you harvested it effectively, you verified it, we knew where it happened, when it happened, and that was it. And actually what's been really good in Ukraine, especially in areas we can't access, is then finding the video content and then I was in change, right? If we're not trying to change things, I know everybody here is trying to change things as well, but you know, we're really, that's why we do the reporting. We don't just say it to say something happened, but we do it to say something changes. And one thing I think where we've had some success at HRW, and certainly in experimentation of formats and bringing new techniques in, such as 3D modeling, into the organization, has been on stories or incidents where nobody really cared about them. And it's in some ways, because there's less global attention on them, it's been a good place to experiment, right? It's like, okay, if this goes wrong, you know, never mind. But if it goes right, amazing. So an example of that is the first 3D modeling we did in-house. was about a prison massacre in Ecuador, right? And we're actually investigating prisoners' rights in Ecuador, like not the biggest topic that people like to talk about. You know, it's not a big public opinion thing. And so we're like, okay, this is a great place to experiment because, you know, we're fighting a losing battle. It's an uphill battle to get people in Ecuador to care about prisoners' rights, you know? And so what if the police let people kill each other inside the prison and don't act, you know, and let them commit crimes? You know, this is a grave violation by the Ecuadorian state. So we built a 3D model of the prison to show, rather than tell, how the violations happened. How, the police were here, you could hear the gunshots at this time. And it took them 8 hours then to intervene, in which period, like, dozens of people were killed each other. And suddenly we got the issue of prisoners' rights in Ecuador to the top of the agenda because we built this model. So it was really interesting, a real surprise to us. And just found out last week that this model is now being used in court and was used successfully by the families of the victims to prosecute the Ecuadorian state for their inactivity. And I honestly think, like, the experimentation using the open source on a subject that nobody cared about made a difference. It's not always the case. It's not always the case that we should be doing the shiny model thing, but I do think it's an important one. And then the other thing we've done a lot of work on is successfully in terms of, again, using open source to make change happen in power was on a report we did last year. Again, an issue that nobody cared about, really nobody cared about, that wasn't a secret. It wasn't like we uncovered this. Was Saudi Arabia executing migrants at its border with Yemen. And the UN had reported on this, had put a letter out about this. Saudi Arabia just said, nah, not us, not us. And because there was no visual proof of this, no visual evidence, everyone just went on their merry way. My colleague, our migrant rights researcher, knew there was a story there, got my team involved. We found hundreds of videos on TikTok of the migrants on the route and then migrants being killed, which corroborated horrendous stories that my colleague was hearing. And this is where we experimented with, speaking to Manisha, speaking to CNN, of how do we then make that content available to news organizations that don't have the time themselves to investigate, and thinking about how do we do pre-embargoes with selected partners and so on and so forth. Probably it's a unicorn report, I would say. It's like probably the most impactful report I've ever worked on in my career. And we persuaded the Americans to stop supporting the Saudi border guards financially. We persuaded the German government to stop supporting the Saudi border guards financially. But Manisha, there was also what I thought was a really interesting element of this, of how we can work together, was then you picked up on the story, and you did more reporting yourself, right?
Yes. So what was really interesting about this story was that Saudi border guards receive training from foreign governments. So I was interested in the timeline of training, the extent of training, and the weapons that were being used to kill these migrants. And so I basically dug into government press releases, both from the State Department and from the German government, and we were essentially able to put together a decades-long timeline of these two governments training the Saudi border guards to essentially be more humane, but the result of which was that they had effectively handed over weapons and training to the Saudi border guards, which was then being used to murder migrants.
Yeah, so just like thinking about how you can work together, like we didn't have the resources to take that story any further. We had to move on to the next thing. But The Guardian did, the New York Times did. There's lots of reporting that came out of that work that was built on, which I think, was really valuable, really, really valuable. And Nick, at the Accountability Project, your audience is a very different audience, right? How do you go about, to the extent that you can tell us, how do you go about kind of engaging with those audiences and thinking about how you push what your findings forward there?
Yeah, sure. So not everything we do is evidentiary in nature. Like, we also run the Ukraine civilian harm map. So if you go to ukraine.bellingcat.com, you'll see this map where we've collected instances of civilian harm, so where civilians have been wounded or killed, or civilian infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed, and then represent that graphically on a map, and you can see over time where that damage has occurred. And that helps to draw attention to these events, which is good. That's part of the advocacy part, but we don't regard it as an evidential product. And so what we'll do is, if we receive a request for information from strategic litigation, something like one of our partners, what we'll do is we can use that information, or we can use that information to help us as effectively seed data to inform our investigations, which are going to be more in depth. So basically what you're taking is like a huge amount of information, you're starting with kind of like the internet, stuff related to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, down to civilian harm, and at that point the relevance of the information starts increasing. So when you get down to specific requests, sometimes you're working off kind of, instance in which there are like 4 videos of an incident, and you start off with this like database of like tens of thousands of videos, and you're really like examining those 4 videos specifically. So yeah, it's really about, it's pretty much the same thing that like journalists do, just taking that information, drilling down into it, and then finding out as much as you can about that specific open source stuff. Yeah. But I mean, it's also worth pointing out that like the work that we do is like very limited in scope. We only look at the open source piece. And that was a deliberate decision, like right at the beginning, because what we didn't want to do, what we wanted to happen is that this information can then be combined with other types of evidence. Because if you say, hey, look, we've got the magic bullet for this, it's not true. Like, this is not a magic bullet that's going to solve everyone's problems. It needs to be combined with other types of evidence, like witness reports, like physical evidence. And yeah, we recognize that we are not specialized in doing that, and so we focus only on the open source side. So we're very specialized in that regard. Yeah,
and it's good to acknowledge that limitation, right, of like the open source only takes you so far, and especially in the accountability process, as I mentioned before, we have to combine it with other things. It's great to combine it with other things. Manisha, how about you on limitations of this work? Like, what are the challenges? What are the less good things?
So a couple of things. One is I try not to do pure open source. I'm too much of an anxious person to do that. So I always try to people on the ground and talk to people on the ground, and then try to match the version of reality that I'm getting from them with what the data is telling me, because sometimes the data is incorrect, or there is a little data vacuum, and sometimes you just find out more facts by speaking to people on the ground. But I think with limitations, what has been great about X, previously known as Twitter, was that it was sort of the breeding ground for some of the best open source investigators that I grew up learning from. But then I'd say since Elon Musk has taken over, there's been sort of a couple of different factors that have completely ruined this environment. The first is sort of information pollution, the fact that the trust and safety team is completely gone and this entire platform is just full of misinformation that is unchecked. The second is state-sponsored disinformation, both by state actors themselves, like the Russian Foreign Ministry account, if any of you are unfortunate enough to follow that, or even people who are effectively stooges for these states pushing out disinformation, and with extremely large followings. And then the other thing that's happened is because the old blue ticks that were sort of based on credibility, however flawed it might be and however Eurocentric it might be, it still sort of had a semblance of credibility to it, which is sort of gone. And now because the verification process is essentially a profit-making exercise for Elon, anyone who has almost no experience in open source investigations can go in, buy that tick, add #OSINT on their little bio, and put out what is effectively false information. Like the other day, when Iran launched the attack on Israel, there was one account known for pushing out disinformation with over 500 followers, effectively pointed to clouds in satellite imagery and said that they were craters from a missile. So that is the level of the discourse right now, and what that means is that there is no space for that healthy, collaborative, really open way of discussing things that led to really good investigations.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, something definitely I think all of us here have felt. Megha, what about you? Limitations?
Limitations. Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, this isn't a limitation, but I think like the kind of work that like you do, Nick, and then you guys do it at HRW. I feel like it's very different from journalistic work in some ways because the goal is different. Like the goal is you're looking for something that's just like straight up accountability. Whereas like people that work in newsrooms, like you have to sort of get to the reader first, or you get to the audience first, and that's like the conduit for which change happens if it does happen. So I think like one of the limitations of open source is that it can feel very clinical. I think somebody already pointed out. So I think it is important to combine it with like sort of other kinds of storytelling, you know, whether that be like visual or narrative or anything like that, just to like sort of increase its effectiveness. And the other thing I was thinking about is just like just questions of ethics around like how we obtain data and who we work with to obtain data in an environment where newsroom budgets are diminishing. You know, one of the pieces we did on that Xinjiang project was we were looking at basically Chinese companies that had set up factories, you know, within the premises of concentration camps and prisons that we had already identified. And we had the geolocation data, but the business data, like the business registration data, was all public, but it was public on like some Chinese government website that we would have had to VPN into China to be able to access. And obviously it was like, it's a government website, so it was pretty clunky. So we ended up working with this research organization called C4ADS in DC. And they were really good. We credited them the story. They basically had access to they had paid for some proprietary database where it was like way easier for them to just be able to search up where these locations were and just sort of plot them on a map. So that helped us tremendously in telling the story. But then after the story came out, you know, we got a lot of flack, not a ton of flack, but we got some flack from people who were like, how can you work with this research organization because they have US government contracts, some of those maybe like military contracts, and you know, they're not journalistic, right? And you know, I really took it seriously because, you know, whenever someone criticizes you in good faith, like you should, I think, and like, you know, I thought it through and I was like, you know, but the information is public anyway. And the reality is like at that time, you know, these were like kind of the twilight years of BuzzFeed News. Budgets were not, you know, quite as flush as they are, you know, in other places. And I think like many newsrooms, like the work just wouldn't have gotten done. We really just didn't have a choice. And I feel like I see that kind of thing happening more and more. Like I'm quite lucky now because I like working at the Times, they have like, you know, really great access to resources, but most places in media are not like that. And I think when I first started doing open source work, like especially with satellite imagery, because it was so new and the idea that journalists would use this was so new, a lot of these companies would be willing to work with you basically for free. But then now that this is something that like, you know, a lot of different organizations use, there's like a lot less access to like these free resources. And then I think that's really combined with these newsroom budgets, it's really diminished the kinds of stories we can tell. And I think when organizations do want to work with you for free, a lot of times there's another motive there. So I think it's like it's a question of like disclosure, I think. Like it's a question of like, how do you explain this to readers? How do you explain like these trade-offs in a way that's like genuine, that's honest? And then how do you make the trade-offs in a way that is ethical and like doesn't compromise, you know, the quality of the work, I think.
Great, thanks. So I think a lot of food for thought there. I think we have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions, I've got one here, one here, one here. I can't see them behind me. Oh no. The lady in the glasses at the front here.
Hi. Good evening.
Mic on? No. Oh, now you're good, I think.
Thank you for this useful information and inspirational session. My question for Manisha and maybe for Nick to comment on it. Going back to Gaza, we are talking about mass destruction. Gaza is laid on a coastal plain, a few mountains, very few marks for landscape, and a very massive destruction on large radius. So when you want to recognize or identify the place for a school was destructed, a hospital or whatever, and you have this total mass destruction and the absence of very distinctive landmarks that you geographically you could find in other places. So how you could go with such limitations and challenges? Thank you.
Go for it, Nick.
Yeah, so I've been doing a project over the last few weeks that's been doing, a few months, that's been doing a lot of geolocations of this. Yeah, hopefully that should be published like next week some point. It's really difficult. It's very, very flat, as you mentioned, and yeah, the extent of the structure means that when you're looking for key features in geolocations, like distinctive buildings, a lot of the time they're simply not there. It's gone, it's just rubblized. And so it is difficult. You also have this systematic difficulty, because if you go on Google Earth, the most up-to-date imagery of Google Earth is the correct resolution. However, previously that resolution was deliberately downgraded. And in the past, you'd be able to, or in other locations, you can look at, you know, like satellite imagery on Google Earth Pro from, you know, like 1, 2, 3 years ago, and you can see, say, for example, the different aspects of buildings. So you can see, okay, on the left-hand side, it's like blue, on the right-hand side, it's green. That's a lot more difficult in Gaza because it was deliberately downgraded because of a United States law, or a law in the US. That's now defunct, thankfully. It is still possible. There are some of the features of like Gaza also mean that some things can be useful. So, for example, there are almost continuous live streams of Gaza from the border. And so when we looked at the strike on the Jabalia refugee camp, what we're able to do is look at, I think it was the Reuters live stream, and then if you know where the camera is, and you can see where the detonation is, and you can see that, you know, just to the left there's a water tower, just to the right there's a distinctive satellite imagery, you can draw that line between the two, and you can do that on Google Earth Pro, and then you know that along that line that's where that detonation took place. And if you look at from another live stream, do the same thing, you can triangulate pretty much precisely where that detonation happened, whether, yeah, that bombing took place. So that actually makes things a little bit easier. But yeah, you do have to spend like significantly more time to do this. And this is also something that I've noticed in Ukraine. Like that contextual knowledge is incredibly important. Within my team, everyone in my team is from that region with regards to Ukraine. And if you want to do this work with regards to Gaza or the West Bank, having that contextual knowledge is incredibly important, especially when it comes to, like, you know, knowing, like, for example, maybe what Telegram groups to look at, also what the names of different places are, because transliterations between English and Arabic can be like very, very different. So yeah, that contextual knowledge is also something that can be used as an advantage and should be used if you're doing that kind of work. Yeah.
Just to quickly add to that, alongside the Reuters live stream, there's the Al Jazeera live stream. There's also an AFP live stream that basically it has its back to the sea and overlooks the entirety of Gaza City. So using sort of 3 different live stream cameras, you can triangulate, but also following the destruction of certain areas. The journalists on the ground in Gaza have done so much in terms of drone footage, but also citizen journalists sheltering at hospitals, civilians. So most of the work when I was looking at hospitals was Instagram lives, Snapchat, their Facebook accounts where they'd say, okay, this is what the building looked like before, this is after the first airstrike, this is after the second airstrike. So I think there is so much collective knowledge and resource on the ground, and there's so much documentation that is when the internet is working and the network is up, that it's tricky, but it's not impossible. On the other hand, I'd say I found doing investigations in the West Bank significantly harder because of the constant bulldozing, because the structure keeps changing every few months because of the constant destruction and the rebuilding. The streets change, the streets all look the same. So when you had, you know, the raids in Sheikh Jarrah, it was absolutely impossible because there were extremely narrow streets where you don't have Google Street View, and you'd see the tank going in at a particular point and then the tank coming out at another point, and the streets sort of look identical. And then because the houses are being built at the same time using almost same materials, they also look very similar. So that I found West Bank much harder, almost impossible to work in.
I think we have time for, sorry, one last question. The gentleman here in the glasses.
Thank you. My name is Hussam Bahgat. I'm from Egypt, and I Absolutely. I mean, I've worked both as an investigative reporter and a human rights investigator, and I absolutely believe that it is not a choice. We have to combine both the investigation and the pursuit of accountability, whether we do it all in-house or with a firewall as Bellingcat or through a partnership, generic or formal partnership. But I also think that we need to be careful about how we, especially as advocates, but also as journalists, speak of open source investigation and the digital investigation, and also show. I mean, we have to frame it as just reporting. It's not science. It's not indisputable, and there's a political responsibility that comes with presenting it as science when we all know it isn't. And we have to be open to, but even invite the same kind of scrutiny that we invite to our reporting as we do with digital investigation. And I mean, the question here for Sam, of course, is I mean, the example much discussed is Human Rights Watch's very early investigation into the shelling of the Baptist Al Ahli hospital in Gaza, much discussed, much criticized. But also, here's a situation where precisely because we didn't have the firewall between your team and the advocacy side of it, you know, your team didn't come up with much evidence at all, but then the way it was framed, the way it was pitched to the media was that it wasn't Israel. It came down to this. And many people argue that this is a situation where it's not the fault of the digital investigation, it's that, you know, based on no evidence, you basically absolved Israel of arguably the first incident of a direct attack on a hospital. So it's not a situation of using the digital investigation to sort through the fog of war. It's a situation where we created the fog of war or participated in that. And many are arguing that that also did not only contradict most of the other independent investigations, but also made it easier for all the other attacks on hospitals and the medical infrastructure that Human Rights Watch documented afterwards. So the question is, how do you look back at that incident in November, and what kind of lessons learned here? Is this a situation where the problem was that there was no firewall between your team and the advocates?
I mean, I think that could be a whole new session, and I'm aware of time, but we can chat about it afterwards. I mean, I think we followed the evidence. We followed what we could find, and we're very transparent about that. And yeah, we published the evidence that we found in deep consultation with a lot of other groups, a lot of partners. There was a whole community, I think, set up to discuss the findings from Al Ali. I stand by what we said. I think it's a good piece of research, and we carried on documenting, you know, all the other attacks that were out there. But I think the important thing was, you know, the evidence we found, we stuck by it. We stood by it, and that's, you know, that was our conclusion. But I'm happy to chat about it more afterwards.
Just very quickly on the scientific part, I think, yes, it is reporting, but a lot of what we work on in open source investigations depends on the laws of physics. And I do stand by Newton's 3 laws of motion. I haven't found a single investigation where Newton has been wrong. So if there is a direct hit and any state actor says there hasn't been a direct hit and there's a massive hole in the side of the building, you know the state actor is lying.
Yeah. Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Megha, Nick, Manisha, thanks so much for this discussion. We could have gone more. Thank you.